In 1969, Brian Jones's body was pulled from the bottom of a swimming pool. His shirt was still buttoned, and a soaked piece of paper rested in his chest pocket. Strangely, years earlier, Brian had written a school essay that described that very scene in chilling detail. It was a quiet death. No stage, no audience, no spotlight. Just a musical genius, the man who helped create the Rolling Stones, now lying in silence. Forgotten by the very band he had built, swallowed by the sound he once gave to the world. Why would a man like that end up this way? Was he pushed out? Or did he know too much? We're going to follow the fragments of memory, the whispers, and the things no one has dared to say, to uncover what really happened to Brian Jones. Chapter 1. Did Brian always know how he would die? In 1969, Brian Jones was found at the bottom of a swimming pool. His shirt still buttoned, a waterlogged letter tucked into the chest pocket. But the most unsettling part, years earlier, at just 16, he had described that exact death in a school essay. Can you imagine it? One of the founding members of the legendary Rolling Stones, yet the first to be forgotten. Brian Jones wasn't just the guitarist with the tousled blonde hair. He was the band's original soul. But before he became a rock icon, who was that boy? Brian was born in 1942 in Cheltenham, a quiet English town. His family was well off. His father, an aeronautical engineer. His mother, a pianist. On paper, it was a stable childhood. But inside that red brick home, something didn't quite fit. Brian was always different, too sensitive, too curious, and far too rebellious. A childhood friend once said, he wasn't like anyone else in class. Always had headphones on, carried blues records, and never looked a teacher in the eye. At 14, Brian suffered from severe asthma, spending months in the hospital, feeling like an outsider. His father once wrote in his diary, Brian needs discipline. He dreams too much. But Brian stayed silent, strumming a guitar with no strings, his gaze fixed far beyond the room. It was during that isolation that he first heard the guitar of Elmore James, and everything changed. By 17, Brian had dropped out of school and hitchhiked across Europe. In France, he was said to have survived by playing harmonica on the streets, its sound echoing through the dark alleys of Paris, footsteps slow, wind cutting at the edges of cheap hostels. Brian, alone, as if running from himself. But what had people whispering was something else. At just 18, Brian had fathered 2 children by 2 different women. He didn't raise them. He didn't stay. I'm not a father, he wrote in a letter. I'm just a man searching for freedom. Some say there were 3 children, not 2. One mother even kept a letter from him, a letter never officially verified. Perhaps that very idea of freedom, passionate, aimless, and, at times, careless, was the first sign of a deeper fracture in his soul. A former teacher recalled, Brian didn't need anyone to teach him music, but no one could understand him either. There was something in his eyes that frightened people. Words that would haunt many, especially when thinking of how Brian died. One chilling detail. At 16, Brian had written a story about a man who drowned in a swimming pool. 14 years later, his own body was found in one. That essay seemed to float like a shadow over his restless youth, from his first rebellion against his father to the day he walked out of school. So, the question remains, from the very beginning, did Brian see the end of his own story? Or was he just a lost boy, shouting into a world that never truly listened? Chapter 2. The founder pushed out of his own band. The man who created the Rolling Stones was also the first to have his voice drowned out by the very music he gave to the world. London, 1962. In a cramped apartment, the smell of cigarette smoke and sweat mixed with the sharp slide of a guitar. Brian Jones was playing a strange riff, fast, wild, almost out of control. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards stood behind him, watching intently. This wasn't just another rehearsal. This was the birth of the Rolling Stones. Brian was the one who started it all. He placed the ad to recruit members, came up with the name The Rolling Stones, booked the gigs, and steered the band toward Chicago blues. A friend once said, "Without Brian, there would be no Stones." He was the conductor of the chaos. But slowly, that control began to slip. Brian was never built for fame. As the band's popularity grew, the press zeroed in on Mick, calling him the leader. Brian faded into the background, often standing off to the side in photographs. In one photo shoot in 1966, Brian stood just outside the frame. That image ended up on a magazine cover, his presence almost erased from history. One fan recalled, "He always looked down, like he didn't want to be seen anymore." Yet Brian didn't retreat. He fought back through music. The sitar on Paint It Black, the marimba on Under My Thumb, the recorder on Ruby Tuesday, all Brian's doing. He didn't just play guitar, he became the sound itself, a musical sorcerer. Once, in the studio, Brian brought in a Moroccan instrument. "This is called a shenai," he said, eyes shining. No one else in the band even knew what it was. But when Brian played it, the room seemed to hold its breath. He spoke through sound, Charlie Watts later said, but no one was really listening. Tensions grew. Brian wrote less and less. He wanted no part of the pop direction Mick and Keith were pushing toward. During one recording session, Brian walked out without a word. Outside, it was raining. The old swimming pool essay came back to him. A friend claimed. Brian brought it up again, as a joke. But in his eyes, there was nothing funny. Another detail unsettled many. Brian once wrote in his notebook that he was slowly drowning in the very band he had created. That page was later found torn in half. A studio tech said he discovered the fragment deep in a trash bin, as if someone had tried to fold it away to hide it. The other half was never found. A studio assistant remembered. "Brian showed me that page. He asked, 'If I disappear, who's going to read this?' The next day, the page was gone." Brian's music still filled the room, but it grew quieter and quieter. Not because he played worse, because the world had turned his volume down to silence. Did Brian step back, haunted by his own obsessions? Or was he pushed out by the very band he brought to life? And if so, who was the one that truly betrayed him? Chapter 3. His music. Played, but no one was listening. Mick and Keith wrote songs. Brian wrote confessions, but those words were never sung. In 1967, while the Rolling Stones were soaring with Let's Spend the Night Together, Brian sat quietly in the studio, his hair disheveled, a heavy leather-bound notebook resting on his lap. He placed his hand on the guitar neck to record a personal demo, but that recording was never released. Rumor had it the master tape was erased by the label itself. Anita, however, insisted it still existed, hidden somewhere in Brian's old basement. Brian was calling a dream into sound, she said. But as the Stones shifted toward pop and psychedelic rock, Brian seemed like a soul out of rhythm. He wore velvet suits, while the rest of the band embraced ripped jeans. Every time he brought in a sitar, a dulcimer, or a harp, he was pushed aside. People said Brian was exhausted. Disputes were mounting. Relationships were fraying. When Mick began dating Marianne Faithfull, the woman Brian had once loved, Brian wrote a single line in his diary: "The cold embrace of trust cut off." During the 1967 European tour, Brian often lingered backstage long after the others. A friend recalled one cold night in Berlin, hearing the sound of a harmonica drifting from his dressing room. It was as if he was calling for someone who was already gone. Brian's name no longer appeared on posters. In interviews, the band spoke only of "we," and no one asked, "What about Brian?" By 1968, Mick and Keith rarely mentioned him publicly. During the recording of Sympathy for the Devil, Brian played only a brief saxophone part. He spent nearly the entire night sitting in a corner of the studio. He had his hand against his cheek, like a child afraid of being left behind. One technician remembered. It was around this time that Brian brought up the old essay again. Anita recalled, he put his hand to his chest and said he felt suffocated. The swimming pool was getting closer. The saddest part was his invisibility. Brian was like a guest being pushed to the sidelines at a party he had thrown himself. A guitar assistant remembered. He came early, left late, and still no one remembered to put his name on the list. By the end of 1968, Brian recorded a short piece built entirely on the sound of his own breathing. He called it, I Am Not Here. No beat, no harmony. It was as if Brian were playing for the dead. Like so many of his other sounds, it was buried. Yet Brian was still there, slowly, patiently, trying to speak, even when no one wanted to hear. Could it be that in a legendary song, someone could be forgotten, while still alive? Chapter 4. The Ex-Lover and the Recording of a Cry for Help. Cotchford Farm was nothing remarkable, just an old English house of red brick, surrounded by damp trees and moss-covered walls. But the upstairs room, where Brian spent his final days, still seemed to hold the breath of someone trapped inside. The 8-second recording was not a song. No rhythm, no melody, just a broken whisper. Help, please, help me. Anita Pallenberg heard it one afternoon when she returned to visit the old house. Her eyes were still red when she recalled, I don't know when he recorded it, but it wasn't music anymore. Near the bed, inside a worn, mold-stained book with its spine coming apart, a letter without a date was found. Tucked between two water-damaged pages, the handwriting wavered, but it was unmistakably Brian's. The final line read, I've lost my voice, but they still love that sound. Music, once his lifeline, had become a weight. He no longer heard himself, no longer recognized the man in the mirror. His long hair fell over his eyes. Every time he set his hands on a guitar, his fingers trembled, not from the cold, but from the belief that no one was listening anymore. The fracture began when Anita left. They had once been consumed by each other, but then Keith Richards entered the picture. Brian said little, but the housemaid remembered one time he smashed the mirror in his room, then sat crying for hours. Perhaps in that mirror, he saw himself, slowly fading away. One winter night, a warm yellow light spilled across the rough wall of the hallway. Brian sat there in silence. His guitar rested in front of him like a friend turned traitor. He told his assistant, maybe I have to live like a ghost. People will see me, but they'll never hear me again. A studio technician recalled that just weeks earlier, Brian had wanted to record a track called Shadow Room. No lyrics, just soft knocks and long breaths. But when the final mix was sent to the label, it was rejected. No one knew why. It's too quiet, they said. And yet, the strange thing is, on his final night, that room was completely still. No music, no footsteps, only a single light burning, like someone was still there, waiting to be heard. If Brian really had been trying to send out a call for help, why did no one answer? Chapter 5. The Missing Key and the Silent Final Night. June 1969. Brian was quietly pushed out of the Rolling Stones. He retreated to an old house in East Sussex, trading away the noise of the world for ivy-covered walls, a swimming pool, and long nights without visitors. He claimed he had found peace, but many doubted it, because the stillness there felt less like peace and more like the prelude to something far more painful. He began recording again, sending messages to a few old friends. Some received 4 demo tracks, but when asked about them later, they all fell silent. What was on those recordings? What had Brian said or tried to warn them about? He wrote letters to Linda and to Pat. In one, he confessed, "I'm learning how to love in silence. It's far harder than living just to be loved." The letter's corner was torn, a black ink stain smudging the page, as if it had been written in haste or unease. His house key was silver, polished. Someone claimed that the night before Brian died, they heard faint creaks moving through the house, a door left halfway open, and that silver key vanished. Did someone enter Brian's home? Or did he open the door for them himself? That night, Brian sat alone in the garden. The frogs croaked in slow rhythm. His hand rested on the pool's edge as he stared at the rippling water. A passerby outside the window saw him sitting like that for over an hour, then walked away. By morning, Brian was found dead at the bottom of the pool. Was that missing key simply another small detail? Or was it the one forgotten clue that could unlock the truth? Chapter 6. Everyone knew, but no one spoke. On the night of July 2nd, 1969, Brian Jones was found at the bottom of the swimming pool at Cotchford Farm. One assistant recalled that the pool lights were still on. There were no screams, no strange noises, only the faint lapping of water, as if Brian hadn't gone under in fear, but had given in long before. What chilled people most was that only hours earlier, Brian had been seen writing something at the dining table. A torn half sheet of paper was found in the trash, soaked, the ink blurred beyond reading. Had someone tried to hide it? And if so, where was the other half? Police ruled it an accident. The evidence was vague. Witnesses hesitated, changing their stories. Frank Thorogood, the builder who was the last to see Brian alive, once admitted, "I killed him," only to deny it moments later. Those who were there that night would later die in silence. None ever told the whole truth. Anita Pallenberg never came back. Keith Richards didn't either. Mick Jagger, who had once called Brian the founder of the Rolling Stones, sent only a funeral wreath. There was no official eulogy from the band. Rolling Stone magazine ran a brief line, as if his death were an inconvenience to be neatly folded away. Yet the room where Brian had lived remained. Years after moving in, the new owner claimed to have heard the sound of water dripping from the pool, though the pipes had long been removed. A gardener once saw a wooden chair move to a different spot in the early morning, on a night when no one had entered the house. A small notebook was found during the clearing of his room. No notes, no lyrics. Only one sentence written over and over: "I'm no longer in their music." Perhaps Brian's death didn't come in a single moment. It came slowly. Every time his part was cut from a track, every time a fan shouted Mick's name without remembering that Brian had written the first riff. A studio technician remembered, "He once asked me a strange question. When the sound disappears, will people remember who made it?" No one ever answered, just as Brian's voice had gone silent forever. One theory mentioned that part of the official autopsy file had gone missing. A man claiming to be the nephew of the coroner said there had been a bruise on the back of Brian's neck, yet it was never recorded. No new investigation was ever launched. And the simplest question of all, still no one dares to ask out loud: why did a man who helped ignite an entire era of rock and roll die as if he had never existed? Epilogue: they loved the sound, but forgot the man who made it. There are people who never quite belong to the world they helped create. Brian Jones was one of them. He wasn't the best guitarist, the strongest singer, or the most charismatic icon, but he was the first spark, the one who gathered wild, untamed sounds and shaped them into the Rolling Stones, a rock machine that would thunder on for more than half a century. And then, he disappeared. Not in a blaze of glory, not under the stage lights, but in the shadows, where no one bothered to look. When Brian died, The Rolling Stones didn't stop. They released new albums, went on tour, collected dozens more platinum records. Brian's name slowly faded, from the press, from the history books, and even from the memories of fans. It took years before people looked back and asked, why? Why would a musical genius, the man who made slide guitar a signature sound, who brought the sitar and marimba into rock and roll, be pushed aside in both life and death? Some say it was self-destruction, that Brian couldn't handle the pressure, that he drowned himself in drugs, alcohol, sleepless nights, and restless dreams. But was that the whole truth? Others believe Brian was never allowed to remain in a band that could only have one star. That once Mick Jagger and Keith Richards took control, Brian became a stranger on his own stage. The silence around his death is a wound that is never fully closed. British police declared there was not enough evidence to reopen the case, even after a man admitted he had once been in the pool. Even with an incomplete autopsy report still sitting somewhere in an undigitized archive. But maybe the most haunting thing isn't the possibility of a plot. It's the forgetting. Imagine creating something that moves the world, then watching it continue without you. Being remembered only in a handful of black and white photos. Mentioned only to contrast with Mick Jagger. Still young, still strong, still singing at 80 years old. Brian once said, "I've lost my voice, but they still love that sound." Maybe that's the truest definition of his legacy. The sounds remain, but the man who made them is no longer there. Today, Brian's room at Cotchford Farm is still a quiet pilgrimage site for a few loyal fans. They leave scraps of paper, single flowers, and folded letters. One note read, "I first heard you in 1964. Now I listen again, and at last I truly hear you." In the shadows of rock and roll, there are names buried beneath the fame of those still alive. But the question lingers. If Brian Jones hadn't died in that pool that night, would the Rolling Stones still be the Rolling Stones today? And if that death wasn't just an accident, who silenced his voice for good? What do you think?